Hi and welcome to the latest edition of Storytime. Thank you for taking your time and joining me and Burnett today. Today we're going to be reading The Secret Garden. This particular copy, was conceived and illustrated, designed, put together by MinaLima. We've read books by them before. They've also done Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. So very much the same situation, amazing designs, amazing illustrations, interactive plot points. And obviously today's one is going to be an extraction. So we're actually going to be reading chapter 8 for today. But before we get started, I wanted to show you guys this. So this, and bring it a little bit closer. Very bright today. There we go. So this is my first copy of The Secret Garden. As you can tell, it's very yellow. It's been well loved and very much looked through on many occasions. And for some reason, as I was looking at it the other day, I noticed that in very faint markings, I have, for some reason, ticked off certain chapters. There's a chapter list in here, including all of the ones at the back, bar one, and a few from the front, with a little note left behind in pencil that says 9 more. I have no idea why I did that. I must have been playing some kind of game. But yeah, the reason why, not only because I love this book and I love this copy and I really wanted to share that with you, the main reason I wanted to kind of show you guys is because if you have a look closely at the illustration on the front of the cover, this particular illustration was one of the original illustrations on the 1911 printing when the book was first written. So there's a little bit of history there, and potentially how Mary Lennox was originally conceived to look. So that's quite nice. Now, for anyone who does know, The Secret Garden has been turned into many adaptations down the line. I'd say my favourite one was part of a series of classic storybooks being turned into films in the 90s. I think that's one of the best particular versions of it, but everyone should have their favourite. But nothing beats the book, so that's why we're going to get involved in the book. Now, I have to kind of share with you a disclaimer, just in case. So, The Secret Garden was written in around 1911, and at that particular time in history, there were different acceptances for people and for how people perceived others. So there is going to be some references in the chapter that we're reading that are unacceptable today for how to call people. So obviously I wanted to apologise in advance if that is going to upset anybody, and give you a chance to obviously back out if you don't want to read it. It's very brief. It's just a reference to another group of people, and it's just, but what is quite interesting is it's because this book is written at the time, it's written in modern text at the time, so the characters are in the early 1900s as well. It's a great insight into people's perceptions of the wider world at that particular time, and so around 1911, it's very much a look at like the British Empire, how much like people's knowledge back home was of the wider empire, and what some of the people who went out to explore the empire did. So seeing as we're jumping into chapter 8, some people may not know The Secret Garden. So where we're picking up the story, Mary is already in England. She's actually in Yorkshire, up at Misselthwaite Manor, and she is living with her uncle. Her parents got sick, they died in India where she was born, and she was shipped home to live with her family. One character that is mentioned in this chapter, for people who don't know the book but do know the adaptations, which is really important, is Martha's mother. Martha works at the house and takes care of Mary, but Martha's mother is rarely included in adaptations, but is actually a very integral part of the story, and she is included in this. And the last thing to mention is I cannot do a Yorkshire accent, and I am not going to offend anybody by trying. So when the parts of the story where there's a character talking who's one of the local characters, I will say what they're saying, but unfortunately my accent will not do them justice that they deserve. So let's get started. And this is, and the illustrations we're going to come back to towards the end, apart from this first one, because they're so important. So this is chapter 8, the robin who showed the way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I've said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. She had thought about the key. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her, and she could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think that the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatsoever to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to work in, and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it, just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood. So the same things had stirred her mind. In India, she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care too much about anything. But in this place, she was beginning to care and to want to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could not see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the wall and looked over it at the treetops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not be able to get in. She took the key from her pocket when she went back to the house and made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever should find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with her cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. I got up at 4 o'clock, she said. It was pretty on the moor with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart and I did enjoy myself. She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and the washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. I had all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor. And the cottage smelt so nice, clean, hot baked, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Duggan said our cottage was good enough for a king. In the evening, they all sat around the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl that had come from India, who had been waited on all her life by what Martha called blacks, until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you, said Martha. They wanted to know all about the blacks and the ship that you came in. I couldn't tell them enough. Mary reflected a little. I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out, she said, so that you'll have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers. My word, cried delighted Martha. It would set them clean off their heads. Would that really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show like we had heard had once come to York. India is quite different from Yorkshire, Mary said slowly, as she thought over the matter. I never thought of that. Did Duggan and your mother like to hear you talk about me? Why, our Duggan's eyes nearly started out of his head when he got that round, answered Martha. But mother, she was put out about your seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse? And I said, no, he hasn't. Though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it. But she says he may not think of it for 2 to 3 years. I don't want a governess, said Mary sharply. But mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman looking out after you. She says, now Martha, just you think of how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about all alone, and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up, she says, and I said I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. You do cheer me up, she said. I like to hear you talk. Presently, Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. What does thou think? She said with a cheerful grin. I've brought thee a present. A present? Exclaimed Mistress Mary. How would a cottage full of 14 hungry people give any one a present? A man was driving across the moor peddling, Martha explained, and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our Elizabeth Ellen said out, Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles. And mother, she called out quite sudden, Here, stop, mister, how much are they? And he says 2pence. And mother, she began fumbling in her pocket and says to me, Martha, thou's brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope. And she bought one, and here it is. She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end. But Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. What is it for? She asked curiously. For? Cried out Martha. Does that mean they've never got skipping ropes in India? For they've got elephants and tigers and camels? No wonder most of them's black. This is what it's for. Just watch me. And she ran into the middle of the room, and taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her, and the queer faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to be doing under their very noses. But Martha did not even see them. The interest and curiosity in Miss Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping and counted as she skipped until she reached 100. "I could skip no longer than that," she said when she stopped. "I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fast as I am then as I am now, and I was in practice." Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel excited herself. "It looks nice," she said. "Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think that I could ever skip like that?" "You just try," urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. "You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what Mother said. She said nothing will do more good than skipping rope. It's the sensiblest toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air, skipping, and it will stretch her legs and her arms and give her some strength in them." It was plain that there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs, and when she first began to skip, she was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop. "Put on the things and run out skipping outdoors," said Martha. "Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a little bit, so as that's wrapped up warm." Mary put on her coat and hat and took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something and turned back rather slowly. "Martha," she said, "they were your wages. It was your 2 pence, really. Thank you." She said it stiffly because she was not used to thanking people or noticing that they did things for her. "Thank you," she said, and held out her hand because she did not know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little shake, as if she was not accustomed to this sort of thing either. Then she laughed. "Hey, thou art a queer old womanish thing," she said. "If thou'd been our Elizabeth Ellen, thou'd given me a kiss." Mary looked stiffer than ever. "Do you want me to kiss you?" Martha laughed again. "Nay, not me," she said. "If thou was different, perhaps thou would want thyself, but thou isn't. Run off outside and play with thy rope." Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she had disliked her very much, but now she did not. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and counted until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining and a little wind was blowing, not a rough wind, but one which came in delightful little gusts and brought a little fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped round the fountain garden and up one walk and down another. She skipped at last into the kitchen garden and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to his robin, which was hopping about him. She skipped down the walk towards him, and he lifted his head and looked at her with a curious expression. She had wondered if he would notice her. She wanted him to see her skip. "Well," he exclaimed, "upon my word, perhaps thou art a young un after all, and perhaps thou hast got child's blood in thy veins instead of sour buttermilk. Thou skipped red into those cheeks, skipped red into thy cheeks, as sure as my name's Ben Weatherstaff. I wouldn't have believed it, that you could do that." "I never skipped before," Mary said. "I'm just beginning. I can go up to 20. "Thou keep on," said Ben. "Thou shaped well enough for it for a young un that's lived with heathen. Just see how he's watching thee," jerking his head towards the robin. "He followed after thee yesterday. He'll be at it again today. He'll be bound to find out what the skipping rope is. He's never seen one, eh?" Shaking his head at the bird. "That curiosity will be the death of thee sometime if thou doesn't look sharp." Mary looked around the gardens and around the orchard, resting for a few moments. At length she went to her own special walk and made up her mind to try to see if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly. But before she had got halfway down the path, she was so hot and breathless that she was obliged to stop. She did not mind much because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin, swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped towards him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy onto the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang aloud, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they are nearly always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in her Aya's stories, and she always said that what happened almost at that moment was magic. One of the nice little gusts of winds rushed down the walk, and it was a stranger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly a gust of wind sprung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped towards it and caught it in her hand. She did this because she had seen something underneath it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of the door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was a loose and swinging curtain, though some of it had crept over the wood and the iron. Mary's heart began to thump, and her hands to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away, and tilting his head on one side as if he were as excited as she was. What was under her hands, what was this under her hands, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found it fitted in the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. And then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. She slipped through it and shut it behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. So that's the end of chapter 8 of The Secret Garden, The Robin Who Showed the Way. There are, being a MinaLima book, means that there are some really cool little features. And the special feature, come a bit closer for you, the special feature for this chapter is Mary finding the garden. So here we go. So beneath the ivy was the door, and then you're able to open the door to the garden. And I think that's actually pretty amazing that that's there. And if you actually look really closely, you can see, oh, there we go, you can see the lock through the ivy, which is pretty cool. So the chapter just before chapter 7, make sure it's right, is the key of the garden, where the robin helps her find the key. And what's quite nice about the feature for that particular one, if I just move the card out of the way, here you have the robin, and then you have the key. Now that's really shiny because it is actually really shiny gold there. So you have the key to the garden. The other illustrations for our chapter, which we just read, shows the skipping rope with handles, which is a really nice little illustration there. And then the other one is the end of the chapter of Mary going through the door. I think what's quite nice about this particular copy is that Mary seems to have kind of more golden colour hair. But she says that you can see the robin, and she's got her skipping rope still around her, which is really nice. And then obviously there's the key from the end of the previous chapter and the robin. So what I really like about The Secret Garden is that it's, like most good stories, it's not just the story of a girl finding an old garden and getting into it. It's a big collective of having a group of people, a very dysfunctional family, which is, despite the setting of her uncle being a lord and her mother and aunts being sisters and being high society and everything that goes with it. It's a story about opening up and finding the people who you can connect to, who you can find a common family with, because Duggan, Martha's mother, everyone comes into Mary's life and really kind of helps her open up and find herself. And because Mary being quite young and not necessarily having the life experience of being able to know how to open up, not just her social setting, but also where she was born, where she grew up, and everything like that, the garden allows her the opportunity to physically open up, and in turn she's able to open up herself. So hopefully you can take that with you when you read this book yourself, hire it, get a copy for your own library, give a used book a home, all of the things that we preach. Or even if you go back and watch one of the adaptations, there's always that element of finding your place and learning to open up, which is nice because I may not enjoy all of the adaptations, personal preference, but the message is never lost, which is really important, and I think it's credit to how strong the story is. So to kind of tie off, I'm just going to read you two very short little bits about the original author, which, oh my god, we never even mentioned, Frances Hodgson Burnett. Her name's really quite faint, basically, so at the top here. And the illustrators, just to finish off. So, for the illustrators, MinaLima Design is an award-winning graphic design studio founded by Mirafora Mina and Eduardo Lima, best known for their 10-year involvement in the Harry Potter film franchise, where they established the visual graphic style of the film series. From their London studio, they have continued telling stories through visuals, from designing books and packaging to graphic design products, to graphic props for films such as Sweeney Todd, The Imitation Game, and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. They also designed the best-selling books The Case of Beasts, explore the film wizardry of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Peter Pan, which we've read, The Jungle Book, Beauty and the Beast, and The Little Mermaid. And then for the author. Frances Hodgson Burnett, 1849 to 1924, was born in Manchester, England on November 24th and immigrated with her family in 1865 to Tennessee, where she lived near Knoxville until her marriage to Dr. S. M. Burnett in 1873. At 18, she began publishing her stories in magazines such as Goody's Ladybook and Scribner's. At 28, her novel, That Lass of Lowry's, based on the colliery life she had known in England, became her first success. But the children's story she published in 1886, Little Lord Fauntleroy, is what made her famous. Its hero's long curls and velvet suit with a lace collar became a popular fashion choice for little boys. Little Lord Fauntleroy was also successfully dramatised, just as her later novel, Sarah Crewe, became the much better known stage play, The Little Princess. While laying out in a garden at her new home on Long Island, Burnett conceived and wrote The Secret Garden, 1911, her best and most enduring work. So hopefully you guys have learnt something, maybe even if it's just a little something about Frances herself that you never knew before, maybe something about MinaLima that you didn't know before, or maybe you've learnt something a little bit about The Secret Garden that might encourage you to want to read the rest of it. And I highly recommend that you do so. So thank you very much for taking, oh my god, Pooh Bear, where have you been? Where did you go? When did you go? When did you fall down? Oh my god, so if you fell down quite early, I'm sorry, didn't notice, and I'm sorry, I didn't notice. But I do hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us, me and him, even if he tried to escape. It's a secret garden, not a rabbit hole, you don't need to disappear. But we'll see you again next time for another great story. So take care, enjoy your day, and thank you for spending the time with us. So it's bye from me and bye from Pooh Bear. Say bye, Pooh. Bye. Bye.